Well, we thank you for coming this afternoon. I'm Janine, I'm the director of the Darien Library. And that's Michelle, she's the director of the Aram Public Library. And we have with us today Marcia Carmichael. I don't know if you know any of these people or not, or if you're just friendly, Marcia. It seems like you're talking to everybody.
I'm getting to know, well, I'll get to know you shortly, right?
Good.
We're getting to know each other, and I already know these people.
Well,
so.
good, all right. So I don't know if they know that you're the author of the book, Putting Down Roots.
Which Pat was nice enough to bring along. So
Very nice.
I can say yes.
Very nice.
There it is.
Talks about gardening insights from Wisconsin's early settlers and what they planted and harvested and the garden tools that they used and what they cooked. So we're anxious to hear what you have to say.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for coming. And it's nice, it's just a small group so that we can go in any direction that you like. I thought I'd talk a little bit about heirloom plants. I picked up the brochure about the seed library, and I think that's a number of libraries are doing this, and it's excellent. There's so many things that you can collect your own seeds from, and it's all about sharing from one generation to the next. So how wonderful to be able to do that in a public space like this. I think that's just terrific. I brought things for show and tell, and if we get bored, we can go out and have tools we can work with, you know, check things out here. I fairly recently retired as the historical gardener from Old World, Wisconsin.
Oh, neat.
So I did that for 13 years, and that's pretty much where the research has come through for the book that I wrote. So the Wisconsin Historical Society had approached me and asked that we pull together the research that had been ongoing and see if we could, you know, put out some information about 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century gardens in Wisconsin. So that's, and in the Midwest, that information had never been compiled before. So it was a great opportunity to dig into all different aspects and look for information and pull together things. Are you all familiar with Old World, Wisconsin? Right, so it's based on research and features the different ethnicities who settled in Wisconsin in the early years. And we then, my job as historical gardener was to match gardens to the buildings, so it's set up as different home sites. And then I could do the research to find what plants, how the plants were laid out, what the garden designs should be, to be historically accurate for the ethnic background of the family who lived there, and also true to the date of restoration, because each site has a different date that the buildings are restored to, and that it's set up. So we sort of did the landscaping. I didn't begin this. There have been historical gardeners before me. I outlasted them all. so far I was there for 13 years, and it was fabulous. Yes.
Do you have like periods, like did the Swedes come in and then the Irish came in and then is that how the migration occurred, or not really? Was it more mixed?
Different. I was surprised. I didn't grow up in Wisconsin, and I was surprised at the diversity of the people who came from European countries and settled in Wisconsin. It's, you know, it's way out this far in the country, and why would anybody come here, right? But in the earliest years, people came from Europe and went to the East Coast, you know, started there for the most part. And people from the British Isles, people from the Scandinavian countries and other parts of Europe came over. Often if somebody came, then they wrote letters home, and they invited more people to come, because here was land that was available. We're at home. There were so many things going on in the old country that there was all sorts of unrest and unhappiness when there was limited land availability for people who wanted to farm. There were upheavals in, you know, with religion, with politics, there were all sorts of things, and the way that land and valuables were handed down through the families varied. So you might, in some countries, you might be the oldest son, and therefore you inherit, and everybody else is on their own. Other people, it's split up, but there was limited amount of land available. So when people came to this country, they started out, especially the people from Great Britain, came to the kind of the northeastern part of the country first, and those became known as the Yankees. And then they moved west as they farmed and used up the land and wanted more opportunity and, you know, were entrepreneurial and they just moved west. So Wisconsin by 1860s was the West, right? So people came out here, this was the wilderness, and the Yankees came out to, they wanted to civilize the wilderness, right? And bring culture out this way. Some of the other ethnic groups came because they wanted a place that looked like home, or a place that they could create something for their families, that they could live on for, you know, generations and generations. So when the Germans came in, they would buy up some land, and then they would get land enough for their children to be in the same area, so that they could kind of all huddle together. And a lot of the ethnic groups who came in large enough numbers tended to settle with their own people. So if, you know, one German settlement came in and then war came because it was comfortable, or one Norwegian group came in, and it might have been through religion or it might have been through families, and then other people came from the old country to settle in because they spoke the same language, they carried the same religion, they had the same traditions, they ate the same food, you know, they liked, you know, did all the same things. So migration came in leaps and bounds, and some people came in larger numbers, some in smaller. So what Oval, Wisconsin did was select buildings from across the state that were representative of these different ethnic groups who settled in Wisconsin. Not all of them, they had a big plan. This was a bicentennial project in 1976 to eventually cover all of the ethnic groups who settled in Wisconsin. And, you know, funding runs out, right? So they got a number of things, but there were other ethnic groups who were never addressed because they weren't able to be in Old World because they ran out of money. So it's a state historical society Old World is the largest of the historic sites for Wisconsin Historical Society. The land is owned by the DNR, so it's an interesting partnership. But the landscape there is beautiful. That area, the Calendulas area, was chosen because it's so similar to, you know, it's got a lot of variety to it. Also, it was a good location for people to be able to come from Milwaukee and Chicago and Madison and, you know, come and visit Old World. So it's about 600 acres of gorgeous, and it was a real joy to work there. And John and Pat were garden volunteers, so I was the only gardener on staff during the years I was there, but I worked with tremendous volunteers, so without them, the dreams that I had would never have taken place. So got lucky that way with wonderful people. We had a greenhouse there where we could raise the plants, and with the research, all sorts of directions to go for research, and I tried to unearth as much as I could. At the time when I was approached to write the book, I was still running my full-time job, so with a little bit of, you know, my poor husband at home who thought I should be paying attention to him when I got there, and I would spend my nights down in the basement, you know, just writing and researching. So it was certainly a labor of love, but it's nice. We have things in here that the editor had asked for recipes from the various ethnic groups that we covered. And also, they initially said they'd like the top dozen plants that each of the ethnic groups grew in their gardens. And that became something more interesting than just the top dozen, because some ethnic groups grew lots of variety and some didn't. So when they didn't have as many things to choose from, or they weren't used to as many things, their favorite flavors were limited, you find that some of the lists are really short.
Wouldn't that depend on the land? I mean, what if the land wasn't as, what if the land that some of the groups had wasn't as bountiful?
If they came later, the good land was taken, right? So the first people here looked for good farmland, and they snapped it up, right? This is pre-railroad, and they took the best land because it would be the easiest. By the time the Finns came, they were left with the cutover land up in like Bayfield County, way up in the north. And it was advertised in the publications that were in Finland that said, come to northern Wisconsin, garden spot of America. This is, the 1890s now. You can grow unlimited amount of things. No heavy frost. You're thinking, wait a minute. You said what? Great waterways. Fair enough. Water, yes. Plenty of timber. Well, yeah, it was cut over land, so you had stumps left on the ground, right? And the ground was either red clay or it was sand, so it was very difficult farming. But the people who came to America often wanted so badly just to have their own land and have something that they could call their own. They were willing to accept that, and then they got those stumps out of the ground, and they worked to improve the land, and they grew what they could. So the farther north, of course, more root vegetables, and the first people who arrived, first crop we put in was always potatoes and turnips and things that you could store for winter, but that you could also get a crop from it and feed the family. So the varieties reflected what they knew of the homeland in the early years, and then as the longer they stayed in America, the more they mixed with other ethnic groups, the more they adopted what other people were doing. So we see the design trends change. From the early years, they looked a lot like their European gardens. In their gardens, the placement of the garden, the design of the garden, the plants that were in the garden reflected the homeland. And as they got more acclimated and more Americanized, then they kind of adopted other things. So initially, the Europeans tended to put the kitchen garden, which supplies the food and medicine for the household, in the front yard, or where it was convenient, where the lady of the house could keep an eye on it, she was responsible for all of that. So it started there. And then these Yankees who got kind of snooty after a while, when they moved in and wanted to civilize things, they said, yeah, well, if you're so poor that you have to have your kitchen garden right in the front yard, well then, how unfortunate that is for you. And it shows you're a lower class person because you have to work so hard and you can't afford to go buy anything. Well, pretty soon you see those gardens moving to the side yard or the backyard because they were then sort of shamed into putting more decorative things in the front. So it's real interesting to watch over time how things change. And we can read through the various periodicals and look at paintings, look at photographs when photography became a thing, and read about what the trends were and what people were doing. And we can look at old recipes and see what everybody was, if they were eating it, most likely if they could, they were growing it. So we got to find then what particular things they're using in the recipes and how they were fixing their food. So we have magazines that came out specifically for gardeners, and Vic's Illustrated Monthly Magazine, at the end of the year you could send in your 12 monthly issues and you could have them bound for a small fee, and then they would send it back to you. And these were written by a gentleman in Rochester, New York, who also included chromolithographs, so he had color. So this brought in color to the house. If you're living way out in the boondocks and you're anxious for the printed word, if you can read, and if you can read English, how lucky for you. This guy was smart enough to know that we also had a heavy German population who were gardeners, because he was also a seedsman. He sold seeds. And he thought, if I can write about them and encourage people to grow these things, I can do my mail order seeds out. And the German population was so renowned for being great gardeners. He also published in German. So when I look at your brochures, you have English and Spanish, I thought it's so perfect because that's what they've been doing. Everybody knew that if you wanted to reach people, you'd better speak their own language. Right. So this gentleman, James Vick, did articles enticing people, how wonderful it was to grow things and how wonderful and how beautiful your gardens can be and what you can do. And then he sold the seeds. So, like a perfect marketing thing in the 1870s and 80s, and then his children took over eventually. There were seedsmen who traveled, and had seeds in boxes that, like I brought this one. So the seed collection could be shipped to stores, or it could be shipped, often this was a sales tool then to go into the local general store or whatever. So they would have your packets of seeds in here. And these boxes then, were eventually used for everything else, you know, in the household eventually, but how nice, and the better the chromolithograph, of course, the more valuable the boxes are these days. But they're so cool because periodically you see these, and they're from seed companies, you know, that they were put out to sell their different seeds, which is really neat. They also sold tools, of course, and some of the old seed catalogs have whole pages with illustrations of tools and prices and things. They didn't cost much to begin with, but there wasn't much money, right, to begin with. So people came with tools from home, for the most part, often just the heads of tools they were used to, and then they would fashion the handles when they got to America. But more and more tools became available. And what's interesting to me is tools have changed very little for the most part. So you had a trowel and you still have a trowel, right? And the garden forks were a thing, right? And you could get garden forks. And
It wasn't in there when
dibbers or dibbles, right? To put the hole in the ground to plant these things. And they've been around, and as the years went by, the handles changed. So this is a little more modern than some of the other things, but they've just, you know, they've had these forever. Pruners, right? Initially, a little on the heavy side.
What year is this? Would this be from?
This is late 1800s.
Wow.
And Peter Henderson, another man who sold seeds, also put out a line of tools and also had wrote books. So they got smart, and they realized that if they would write about it, then people would follow them, like Peter Henderson, James Vick, right, one of the James Vick illustrations right out of his Illustrated Monthly magazine.
So they had a company that made these tools?
Yeah. So there were companies that just did that, and they could market what there was hunger for all these gardening implements and gardening things. Yeah, don't cut your fingers off.
I won't.
They're still similar to clippers.
They are. They totally are. And you know, little ones like this, they developed a line of tools for ladies, because ladies and children, to encourage them to go out into the gardens. So I'm thinking most of the European-born women were fine with big tools like that. Those Yankee women who wanted to stay in the house and do needlework and painting and make little wax flowers and that sort of thing were being encouraged in the publications to go out and garden. Partly because, you know, it was supposed to be healthful, but it was also supposed to, you know, build a more upstanding citizen, right? You'd be a better person if you could go out and you could, you know, create wonderful gardens. And they give directions in some of the ladies' books about take 15 minutes a day and get out there and try. Don't do any heavy work, but get out and, you know, do a little gardening. And then after you get going with that, go for half an hour a day. And then maybe an hour. And you can get, you know, the hired help to go and do the big heavy digging and the turning over of the soil and that kind of thing, and the manuring, because that was the fertilizer. But ladies, you could get out there and you could do things. And they even one lady went so far as to talk about what clothes you should wear when you're in the garden, because all those layers and multiple, you know, petticoats and when bustles came along, those have no place in the garden, right? So they talked about what to wear in the garden, which is just a stitch. And then, well, what about kneeling in the garden? You didn't want your dress to be on the wet ground, right? So you lay out a piece of rug and you kneel on that. And if that wasn't good enough because the ground was too hard, well, then you took an old cereal box and you maybe could cover it with an old piece of calico and you could kneel on that because that would give you a little bit of cushion. So they had to spell out some of these, and I'm sure the European-born women were saying, oh my gosh, you know, you've got to hold their hands and you've got to pull them out into the garden and show them how wonderful this is. So,
But didn't they have to protect their skin too?
absolutely, so you had to have your head covered.
Yeah.
Because the darker your skin showed the more, more you had to go out and work, and you weren't really ladylike. So they, you know,
They had white
said
skin.
very pale skin was all the rage. So you had to have long sleeves, and gloves were, you know, calf gloves or something, leather gloves were available. They were introducing rubber, but that wasn't as comfortable because it tended to be too big a size. But the leather gloves you could, you know, be a little more comfortable in. Big hat, right? And then all the proper tools. And there were, of course, the long handle tools that were available for the, you know, the hard work. again, for ladies and children, they devised smaller versions, shorter handles to use. A higher price for those delicate little things, but those were the people who could afford to buy them. So they were looking at a whole new audience trying to expand out. So when it came to weeding, they have these really ingenious finger weeders, right, that you get in and you scratch with, and I find I use this all the time. So when I was looking to bring tools, I thought, well, I was looking at the things I don't use too much, and well, where's that other one that I use? And I thought, oh yeah, I better wash them up because I use them so often that it comes along. So they had these, and then they have these, also weeders that can get in next to the plants, right? And supposed to, they're sharp edged, and I can pass any of these around if you like, but they're to get the weeds out. Another nice hand tool. And because we don't see these anymore, when I go with my husband to the tractor shows and I look at what they have in the trash and treasures things, I'm always looking for tools because they're cool and they speak to me. And I spied up, can't remember which one it was, but one of these in a bin of assorted junk, and I pulled it out, and I think it was marked very reasonably, and I held on to it while I looked at everything else. Because I thought, I want that, and boy, is that reasonable, because if you were going to buy it online, it would be, And so when I said, I'd like this, I didn't say anything else, I would like that. And the gentleman said, oh, well, what are you going to do with that? He says, I think that's an old hide scraper. I said, or a weeder. So if they don't know, sometimes they don't know.
They don't make those anymore,
I don't see these. Have you seen these?
No, but it looks like my hoe. I have a hoe that looks like that.
Right?
And
Right.
you can just scrape back and
Right.
forth.
I have always,
Yeah, and so many different styles of hose. So the original ones were the rub hose, the great big head,
Oh, yeah.
cast iron. And I loved that. In Old World, the ground was so horrible. And you needed to, hack in and get the sound off and get everything else, and that would cut through everything. And that was my favorite. But then as the ground got better worked, then they went to lighter weight things. And, slimmer, nice looking, the gooseneck hose, and then the onion hose and the specific ones, with the triangular head and the pointy head and the curved, right? So all those, and the scuffle hoe. So all these tools that we see now, with a very few exceptions, look just like they did in the old days, which is kind of neat. And the same with gardening advice. So when you read in the old periodicals about how to garden and how to take care of your ground and when to harvest your seeds and how to save your seeds, the advice hasn't changed. And that's what I was astounded that so much has stayed the same. So when you read the old things and you think, well, that's pretty cool. Well, that's just what the new books tell you. So we haven't learned anything here. We just have to keep sharing that information. So these chromolithographs were, some of the illustrations out of the books. And when your monthly magazine would come, and you just get your little pamphlet, 15 or 20 pages, and people would pour through that. But when they found that if they could include a printed picture along with that, people would then hang those up in their houses, right? Because you take that out and you could decorate your house with it. So the marketing that went on with these was phenomenal. How ingenious they were to get people to subscribe to the magazine because their wife wanted the pictures, right? And the farming magazines tended to not have, like Wisconsin Farmer and things, didn't have as many illustrations, but the ones that were trying to appeal to a wider audience, lots of black and white drawings, and then a few colorful things. So it's been really interesting. We had seed companies in Wisconsin as well, or in the early years. This is the Salsa seed company in La Crosse. And this was one of their seed covers. So as the time went on, the vendors also realized if they put a pretty cover on the catalog, and that they started to do seed packets that were attractive. That also would entice people to purchase things. So are you guys familiar with the great nurseryman who was a Milligan? Franklin Kelsey Phoenix was a established a nursery in the 1840s in Delavan. So his father was the Colonel Samuel Phoenix, right, and his brother who, founded Delavan, and their son, Samuel's son Franklin, then was interested in gardening, and when it was 1842, he set up a nursery in Delavan, and it went on for about a dozen years, and then it got to be so big, he moved his business to Bloomington, Illinois. He was raising plants for sale, and he, in Illinois, in the late 1850s and in the 1860s, he had 200 acres of plants, and he was the biggest operation in the country. And we don't hear about him, and yet he was phenomenal. Then he had a number of bad years, weather and insect problems and things, and eventually he had to fold his business in Bloomington. He came back to Delavan in the 1870s and set up business again under another name and continued on, and then finally sold the business when he retired in 1900. Part of the fun of research is you find there's so many things that are close to home that you don't know about. And this same man married into his wife was the daughter of the founder of Darien. So, it's like, we're home and we have these people. So one of my volunteers spent a lot of time researching the Phoenix family and getting history so we could pull that together, because it was so important to agriculture and horticulture in Wisconsin that how come we don't hear about these people? And eventually they just sort of disappear. But exciting to think that things were going on. There were nurseries established in Wisconsin in the early years, in the 1850s and 60s. It was big business.
How did they start their nurseries? Did they buy plants or did they?
They bought plants in originally, and then first thing people wanted to buy was fruit trees because they couldn't raise them from seed. So they had fruit trees shipped in, and then there was a lot of breeding that you can read about in the agricultural periodicals about the breeding of trees to be hardy in this climate. So, the ones they originally thought might make it, they had to do a lot of, breeding, which worked out very well. And so they expanded their fruit crop because that was a big thing. So acres of, apples and pears and plums and, on and on. Yes.
I've always been fascinated by Door County cherries, and I wonder what the history is. I've heard that the climate is perfect.
Climate is different from the rest of the state.
Right, and that the cherries are just in the perfect spot to harvest them, to grow and harvest them there.
So as people found where things did well, then they could expand out and even in western Wisconsin where you see a lot of apples now, it becomes sort of what they're known for.
So it must be climate specific for certain fruits.
And soil types, yep. So, right, and when people found it, families wanted to try some of everything. So when they first moved into their home ground, they put in apple trees because there'd been luck with those, and everybody liked apples. And apples were often, or fruit was often the dessert, it was the sweet. They didn't have access to the expensive sugar and that kind of thing until they started like maple sugar, or otherwise they had to purchase sugar, which was cost prohibitive for a lot of people. So fruit was, and in the old country, fruit had been the big sweet, as we would think of. But out of fruit and out of potatoes. yeah. So there was money there, right? Yeah. So there was and out of grains. So some of that was right for business and for your home consumption as well.
Sorry.
That's
What's
not
that? I thought I turned this off.
But I think, so the nurseries, I think, started with fruit crops, and trees and shrubs and that sort of thing, so gooseberries and raspberries and currants and that kind of thing. Things that people who were coming from the old country wanted to have here and would buy readily, and then they were bred to have stronger and stronger varieties and different varieties, and then lots of different apple trees, and then so all the different fruit trees, and if they could sell them, whether they did well or not for the individual, the seller didn't really care, right? They tried to get hardy varieties and they advertised hardy varieties. But then they also eventually started selling like potted plants. And all the way through, potted plants had been popular because in the long winters in Wisconsin, especially at that time, people wanted something alive that they could just, feel like there was still life out there. So they grew potted plants on the windowsills, and there's great remembrances in people's diaries about how they traded cuttings with their neighbors of different flowering plants, because especially if you could have something that was flowering, put that on your windowsill. If that bloomed in the winter, you thought God was right with you, right? So it was a big deal. So you can imagine life was fairly colorless in the wintertime in Wisconsin. So if you could have colorful pictures, and if you could have a plant that bloomed, or you could have, and then the flavors of home, right? So if you could put up your food, that you could also fix meals in the wintertime that tasted like your homeland, that would be wonderful. So the nurserymen established themselves on what the public wanted, and then they set about letting people know that they also should want this, and they should want this, and they should buy more and more things. And then they sent out salespeople with pictures of their different fruits or vegetables, very beautifully done, chromolithograph again, beautiful artwork to show what the fruit would look like, so that you should buy these trees, or you should buy these shrubs just on this picture alone. So the salesman would go out with their catalogs and their pictures and show them, and then people would buy them up, and they would ship them. When the railroad came through, they could ship them by rail, otherwise they had take them out by wagon. So you had all your food crops going that way, and then seed, different varieties that came with people from the old country, ones that they traded with other people when they were here, ones that were bred to be stronger. They always saved the seed of the best plants that were growing in the garden so that they could continue them on, and they were selective about that. And sometimes they wrote to the old country and said, I don't find this variety of turnip, can you send that over? So, and then some of the seedsmen realized that these things were coming in from the old country, and perhaps they could step in on that, and they could get that business so they could sell them here. So the businesses just grew and grew, but people have been, of course, saving seeds forever, and we continue that now. The flowering things that people grew, we see the old roses that came along, and it's documented that they came west by wagon train. People brought things from the homeland or from, whatever, something that was beautiful, that meant something special to them. So that's what heirlooms are all about. They're the chosen things that people have really taken to heart. This is what I want to keep. This is what I want to remember the old country with, or my family with. This is what I want to pass on to my children and my grandchildren, so that we can keep these things going. And what better way to do it than plants? Because in a few short years, you can have multi-generations of these plants, and you can share them and give them to people. And if the people that you want to share with don't grow things, well, you can grow it and you can share the produce with them, or share the bouquet with them, or you can share a recipe and some of the produce. So there are so many ways to share these. I brought a few pen sniff bouquets here, because what are plants without fragrance, right? Before I was the gardener at Old World, I had my own herb business, and I had greenhouses, and I raised and sold more than 700 varieties of herbs and scented geraniums. So I had sort of a passion for some of the fragrant things. So we've got calendulas or pot marigolds, where these guys are, except for this one, everybody else is annual that you could collect the seed from. So these orange guys, the petals are used, and they can be added to salads. They can be put into soups and sauces. They can be used to decorate cakes. There's not a lot of flavor to them, but they also are useful in ointments to treat burns. and they're good for baby skin because they're so gentle. So sometimes they were called the poor woman's saffron because they had kind of the color, but they also had really good usage. And then cornflowers or bachelor buttons, these little guys, were strongly popular with a lot of the Europeans because they grew wild in the fields of grain. So people had a memory of seeing cornflowers and poppies or bachelor buttons and poppies growing in the fields, and it just felt like the homeland. So those were kind of important if you want to have a nod to some of your ancestry. And then Love in a Mist or Nigella is this other blue one, and that's just a really pretty flower. And ambrosia is a scented green. And then this is lemon verbena, because I could. And it was popular. So it's a pet and sniff bouquet. And this other one are a couple of different amaranths, which you could collect the grain. Some varieties of amaranth are used as a grain crop. These are mainly decorative ones, are also good dye plants. There's some lavender here. There's an annual clary sage, Salvia viridis, and those guys all can be grown from seed. Some lavenders are better propagated vegetatively, but there are some varieties that can be grown from seed. And the lavenders were grown for their fragrance. It was recognized as a nice, clean fragrance. And then rose-scented geraniums, the scented geraniums have been popular for a couple hundred years, and they're not winter hardy, but they're great fragrance and you can use them for cooking.
It's my understanding lavender is supposed to be helpful for your sleep.
Yes, lavender is calming, it lowers the blood pressure. Also good, the lavender oil to treat burns. But yeah, if you need to calm down a little bit, the pillow of lavender sachet is really wonderful.
What is that okay again? I'm sorry, I missed it.
For which?
This one. The spiky.
These guys are amaranths and lavender and Salvia viridis or annual clary sage. And then this little fella down here is a rosebud geranium, and those came over with some of the early German settlers. So again, propagated vegetatively like the scented geranium, but pretty and something from the homeland.
Did you grow these yourself?
I did. These came out of my garden this morning. I no longer have greenhouses to cut from, and I don't have acres of dozens of gardens to go out and cut from, so I have to cut from home. So these are things, yeah, that I use. Oh, let me put his roof down. Thank God it grows.
What a wonderful
Do you have
profession.
lots of gardens?
More now that I'm retired than I ever did before. I spent my first year getting rid of the thistles and quack grass and that sort of thing, and now
How did you get rid of the quack?
you just keep going. And a nice little aside, quack grass, when the early Polish settlers and people in Poland were starving, they found that if they dried the roots of quack grass and ground it up, it could be used like flour. It also has medicinal benefits. So I try and think of that when I'm yanking that stuff out of the ground. But every last piece of quack or all those other terrible weeds have to get out or you've got it back. So working with lots of people in the gardens at Old World, I found that, sorry John, but a lot of the guys were in a hurry to just, get the big lumps out. And they left all the little pieces behind. All those little pieces made big plants. Right? So I find that if you just get those forks in the ground, and get every last bit of that piece, and then it's gone. But you have to keep at it. And it's never ending.
Yeah, it's never.
Yeah. So just a quick, got some pictures of some of the gardens at Old World. And you can look at the different.
Insane.
It doesn't want to go quiet.
How do you get rid of something that's really invasive in your flower beds?
Just perseverance.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
Just
jumping to other.
try and get them before they seed if it's something that's throwing seed out. If you see seed heads, cut them before they mature. All right, so if there's something that's pretty, you can let it flower, but don't let it get to seed. And just keep at them, and then probably best to not compost that seed either.
Right.
Throw it away,
Right.
right? Trash it or burn it or something, because, you know, things like garlic mustard, it'll come right out of the compost pile and come to bite you. And you can use that too, but I choose to get it out of there.
Yeah, we have land behind us, it's not ours, and there's all sorts of stuff
Oh.
in there.
Yeah, if you can get the owners to clear it, but,
Well, if you have been told garlic mustard, if you don't have time to get it all out, if you cut off the top before it flowers,
right?
you're doing better then, so it won't spread.
Well, it won't seed, but, yeah, it probably will come back. Yeah, I
Yes,
have found with garlic
but
mustard, if I
it
cut
won't.
it short, it will bloom short. So it comes right back with flowers again, and they bloom short, so it's real, yeah, and we're waiting for good rain, and then you yank them out, because they got that tap root. And you would think if you disturb it, that's good enough, but it's not good enough. So I was horrified to go underneath some of the evergreen trees at home the other day, and see that we had some garlic mustard that I had not addressed, and it was seeding, and it was like, right, so I ran out with a trash bag, and I was pulling and sticking them in the trash bag, and I gift wrapped it and sent it off to trash. My husband said, well, why don't you compost that? I said, not garlic mustard, just not, because that will come back from a piece, it will come back from seed. Now, and each one of those seed stalks must have hundreds of seeds in it, they're just prolific. So if you can somehow turn those into something saleable, you know, if you could say it was an aphrodisiac, or if you could say it was, would kill COVID, or, you know, something that
Right.
maybe people would like them, but other than that, it's kind of hard. Anyway, some of the different styles of gardening. The Germans tended to like things really well manicured and orderly, and they mixed flowers and vegetables and herbs in the same beds, which is really cool. So you don't have to do just a vegetable garden and just a flower garden. And I think we've seen more and more books now that show how you can you use pretty things in the garden, and your gardens can be pretty by adding things. So just some of the different flowers. These are all old world pictures. The Yankees tended to do, let's see if I have any more in there, no. They did kitchen gardens probably smaller than most of the Europeans, but in Old World we had a 1/4 acre space, which was about typical for Yankee kitchen gardens. So we had put in, this just shows the front decorative part, but we had rows and rows of vegetables in the kitchen garden. And we also redid the front garden in the front of the house, so we tried to change the landscaping up. But it was typical for the Yankees not to grow flowers in with their vegetables, but to have beds just for cutting. So they put in beds that were for cutting flowers for bouquets for the summertime, and then we also put in a bed of flowers that could be dried for wintertime use. So they, you know, dried flowers so you'd have something pretty. Because remember, the Yankee women didn't mind doing flowers in the house and doing pretty things. They just didn't want to be out there hoeing the old vegetables. The Norwegians who came early tended to not come with much money, so they were subsistence farmers, and they were just beds of basic vegetables. So they did turnips and rutabagas and onions and potatoes, big on potatoes, because those you could eat. They grew squash and corn that they learned about New World crops, but they thought they weren't safe for human consumption, so those were grown for the animal food. Too bad, all those vitamins they missed out of the pumpkins, but there you are. And then some of the more affluent Norwegians had really finely built homes and put in nice kitchen gardens. Also in 1865, which is when this one garden was restored to, wool was bringing in good money for uniforms for the Civil War because cotton was so limited in availability. So a lot of the Wisconsin farmers also raised sheep for wool and found there was good money in that. So diversifying was a really good idea.
They could knit their Norwegian sweaters.
You got it. Which they did, and the Norwegian women were so so busy and so work so hard. There are entries in some of their diaries of carrying a bowl of yarn in their aprons and knitting while they were walking to their neighbors. And you think, wow. Yeah. Hopefully the ground was level.
They made the left side of the potatoes.
That's right. While the Poles were making fun.
Yeah.
And eating. So again, the German beds, sometimes edged with boards or rocks or something, and sometimes not. Sometimes just defined well. In an old world, we also use lots of different pathway materials to show what was available and what could be used. So the 31 farm that we have had a whole area that was devoted to fruit, had a decorative bed at the front, and then has a kitchen garden out on the side. Different fence styles that were well researched, gates, pathway materials, everything was as authentic as we could make it. And the gardeners wove the fence. And it's a great use for buckthorn. So another invasive problem, we see it, this is a buckthorn fence woven vertically here. And then this one was woven horizontally. So depending on what style or what material you have, in Europe they use some heavy clematis vines often for weaving. They use willow. You know, if we had some good strong willow available, that would have been faster and a lot easier. But because of all that acreage, that old world, we've got buckthorn because it goes like garlic mustard, right? Only bigger. We ended up using that, and the poles, or the upright poles in this fence are as close together as they are because it had to accommodate the height of the buckthorn. So you too can do this in your own yard, should you so choose. All right. And then when the Germans became more Americanized, they took that front yard kitchen garden, this one, all right, and bumped it to the side, still on the south side, but to the side of the house, and then put flower beds in the front. And put grass in, which, like, for the Germans would have been the ultimate because it didn't bring anything to the table. It wasn't good for anything. It was just, you know, a nightmare for how to keep it cut. But that showed that they were becoming Americanized. So, funny what we'll do when the influences tell you that's what you should do. But rows and rows of vegetables, the Germans still, by the 1880s, they were growing in rows because that's what the periodicals were recommending. That way you could go through with a mechanical wheel hook, one of those things that you could through. Supposedly you could send all your kids out to do that. And then you probably, if you're German, you probably ended up out there hoeing anyway because you were too frugal to go and buy one of the wheel hooks. But they still mixed flowers in with their vegetables. So part of it, I think, that whole aesthetics thing. You're going to spend that many hours in the garden, it look nice as well. Partly companion plants, and partly flowers that you can cut and use. Yeah.
I garden at the Williams Bay
Yes.
Garden, and I see a lot of people using both vegetables and flowers.
Isn't that nice?
It really is.
And some of them benefit each other, and they look cool together. And then when you harvest one, the other one can take over
Right.
for some of that stuff. Yeah, so it's a really good idea. I don't know why it took us so long when we were growing up, that wasn't the thing. But we're finally back around to that. Like, you know, edible flowers, which have been edible flowers for centuries, and it took us a while to come back to that. So all these things that we hear about and we think, oh, this is innovative, put flowers in with the vegetables. Well, it's been going on for thousands of years, right?
It's like what wasn't popular is popular.
Right.
That's right. You just wait long enough, it comes
Like
back.
front yard gardening.
That's right.
It's
Coming back now,
Yeah,
coming
being
back.
acceptable again. Yeah. Although there was a lot of noise about that
Yeah,
when
right,
we first started
right.
out.
What do they put between the rows? What do they use?
In the kitchen gardens, when it was just like in the white space between the rows, there wasn't anything being used. And when I was the head gardener at Old World, it was important to me that we represented exactly as it was. So So we continued to hoe between the rows.
Just dirt then.
Yeah, so we just kept hoeing. It was described as straight rows, neatly hoed, right, to be clean from weeds. Laying out mulch saves a lot of that. But we did that on the pathways, but because I couldn't support it historically, we just kept hoeing, unfortunately. But, yeah, so learning through history, we now know you can mulch all those rows and you'd be happy for it. Yeah, well, we also found that old world when we did pathways with straw, when you harvest with the old mechanical harvesters pulled behind the horses, they don't get all the grain heads out of the grain. And we had pathways that sprouted wheat, rye, oats, anything with it, whatever we're growing, we had it in the pathways. And that became a nightmare. So now when you if you bought straw for pathways, or you have a neighbor who's a farmer, or you have a farm, you have cleaner straw. So, some straw is better for pathways than others, some's more slippery, some's got a little grit to it. But a lot of the grain heads are out of there, and that's a blessing. Because boy, we would, with as many gardens and acreage as we had, you'd get done with one and you'd go to the next one and you'd look back and that one's sprouting at the pathways again. It's like, no! Yeah. So a lot of help. And hopefully a lot of friends who want to come out and help. So the Danes were not as austere gardeners as the Norwegians tended to be. They had more influences in Denmark that had come up from Italy and France, so they had a little more decorative gardens as well. And they tended to put borders of flowers in their gardens as well as mixing flowers. We talked about the Finns with the cutover land. This is a Finnish garden, lots of rutabagas, lots of potatoes, and then other root vegetables in particular. And then we put in a rockery or a rock garden for them because the Finns tended not to do decorative flower gardens because they thought that, the thought in their heart was that you couldn't improve on Mother Nature. And whatever Mother Nature did in the wild was as good as it got. So we would bring in plants that could have grown from the wild and put them in with rocks. We made a rock garden. And we had a second Finnish garden that we put in a rootery, R-O-O-T-E-R-Y, a rootery, because they, in the cutover land, they had all those stumps available, so you could flip some of those up and make something interesting and then plant around them. And after Old World had a tornado in 2010, we had a lot of stumps available. So we took some of those and flipped them and used those at the Rankin garden. One in the front.
Do you have a picture of that?
Not in here.
But if I wanted to Google on it, what would I'd like to see what it looks like.
Yeah, it was just a small flower bed with some stumps in it. But
Okay.
flipped up so you could see the roots.
Okay.
Yeah. Catch me again sometime.
I have one in my yard, and
Yeah.
I'd like to maybe do that,
So this was a matter of stumps that had already been taken out of the ground and then put in to be decorative. But you can certainly plant around them. You can put a pot on top. You can hollow out the top. You can make a bench out of it. Stumps are kind of cool, unless you need to farm around them.
Put pastas all around them.
Yeah. Depending on what else you got to
They
do.
put a plat on it and then pastas around it.
Nice. Yeah, nice. The Yankees it was important that they portray things decoratively to the public that was going by. So we put in ribbon beds, which were plants planted like stripes in ribbon in the front of this one, and this was in a village location. And this is an Irish house, and we had some roses. We planted plants that the lady of the house would have remembered from her homeland in Ireland. She didn't learn to read or speak English, Mary Hafford, this particular lady, but she worked and had to support her family after her husband passed away, and she ended up having her children be fully educated, and she took in laundry in order to make ends meet. Eventually, she had this house built, and she moved into the village of Hubbleton. So she was in a village setting, so we gave her a carpet bed, which is plants that tend to grow fairly well that are laid out like patterns in carpet. But we used plants she would have known in Ireland. So my thoughts with designing the gardens was always, I put myself in the place of the lady of the house and what would she relate to, and what would make her proud when she'd step out. And then we just did it on a smaller scale. Because we didn't need 3-acre gardens, for vegetables that old world. So, nor did we have time to weed all those rows, right? Polish, again, just beds, and just beds in the ground, kind of planted massively. Bohemian family had the shoe shop, and that was in our Crossroads village at Old World. So we put in a decorative flower bed, and this was restored to 1885, which was a time when annuals and perennials were starting to be mixed in the same flower gardens. So that was a thing, because originally, for the earlier years, annuals were the front guard because they were non-stop color. All you have to do is deadhead, they bloom, they can color all season. Perennials have a bloom season, and then they're done until next year, for the most part. So when perennials started to be used with gardens, they were put on the side of the house or they were put in the back because they were thought to be interesting, but not good enough to make the front yard. So eventually, just like mixing flowers and vegetables and herbs together, they thought, well, we could mix perennials with those annuals and we could have a little bit of both. So when you have the bloom time with the perennials, that's great, but you always have the annuals. So that's what we did here. And lots of color, because that's what the Bohemian's like. Oh. Yeah, this is the garden, the kitchen garden of the one we were talking about with the rotary, but it's not, I don't have a picture of the rotary here. The school grounds became a focus of beautifying. So there was this movement to beautify school grounds to make people better and more upstanding citizens as they were students. And so the idea was you put a decorative garden in the front and you teach all about aesthetics and beauty and the value of being a good citizen and a good person. And in the backyard you do more utilitarian garden and you teach agriculture, horticulture, and you can harvest out of the back garden, not the front garden, that's just for show. Obviously, Yankee influence, right? So in the front yard, we put in a decorative bed, and we put it in on Memorial Day so we could have children help us plant it, which was a nice thing. And then in the backyard, we had more small kitchen garden type thing. Often that was used to feed the schoolmaster or the school mistress. So, and also to teach the children. So that's the picture book from online.
It's a picture of the bank.
Sandy Matson made me do it. We've gardened in period clothing. So, fortunately, they didn't enforce the rule for gardeners to wear corsets during work. The people who worked in the buildings were wearing corsets. So they played the Yankee card and they hesitated to want to come out into the gardens. So anyway, but those of us who worked on site always wear period clothing. So lots of experience in how to stand up with a long dress on. So you stand up in 2 stages because at first you get off your knees, no doubt you've got your foot on either your petticoat or your hood of your dress. So you pick it up and you go again. Turns out to be fine because then you have to wear sunscreen because you're covered head to toe. Could be a little warm, but we didn't get burned. We just got hot. So I probably used up my time. I think we've done show and tell across the table. If you have any questions,
Very nice. Very nice.
the important thing I think is share what you have, and share what you love with other people so that it can go on for generations to come. And thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.